Welcome to Plaid for Women TV, your go-to resource for the business of life. Whether the CEO of your home or your own business, women struggle with the same challenges. At Plaid TV, we discuss real-life issues affecting real women and offer solutions to help you achieve your goals, get connected, and be heard. Together, we will change the world. Let's do this. No mean girls allowed.
Hey, welcome everybody to Plaid for Women Television. I'm Siobhan Palmer. In our second segment on diversity inclusion, we'll be focusing in on the definition of diversity inclusion as outlined by Tarrant County College. Also some very interesting subtopics, cultural humility, and also the difference between equality and equity. I'm delighted to welcome back Ms. Shani Barrax Moore. She's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Tarrant County College. Shani, welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
I'm very excited about the second segment. So again, diversity and inclusion, we've heard those terms over the last 5 to 10 years. Why don't we drill it down and define it from the Tarrant County College perspective?
Well, diversity in general has really evolved over the years, really from the 20th century into the 21st century, from the obligatory to the strategic.
I love that, yes.
So we probably remember back in the 70s where it was about affirmative action and it was sort of what you must do, that it was regulated by federal guidelines, which isn't to say that affirmative action isn't still around, but that was really where we began.
Okay.
Then it moved from affirmative action to hearing more about diversity, which is really more about representation. Historically, many of these organizations that were talking more about diversity, it was, well, let's get more people in here that don't look like us. Right. So we've evolved from that, and it's not just people of color, and diversity has a much larger definition, both for Tarrant County College and overall. So then within the last 20 years or so, you started hearing more about inclusion. Before it was just diversity, now it's diversity and inclusion. And inclusion really focuses more on the climate. Absolutely. Yes, now you have the compositional diversity, whether it's visible or by hidden identifiers, but inclusion, and that's in large part what we focus on, is what does it feel like to be a member of the community and focusing on the climate. And then finally, when you're really being intentional about inclusion, you're really acknowledging differences and seeing differences and integrating them into your approach. And that's where cultural humility comes in. And that's kind of where we've evolved from the obligatory with affirmative action to being more strategic as it relates to cultural humility.
Shani, how does Tarrant County College define diversity?
That's a really great question. Our definition of diversity is really broad on purpose. Before, when you would hear diversity, you would think maybe just race, gender, maybe class. Our definition of diversity involves 11 main identifiers. 11.
Wow.
So we have gender, race, religion, age, ability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity.
Wow.
Those 8 are what we typically call core identifiers, because often when you ask a person what has the most impact on their perceptions, experiences, and interactions, it'll be one of those 8. Not all the time, but very often.
Right.
The other 3, veteran status, which is very, very important for Tarrant County College because we have various veterans programs. And then as a result of the diversity and inclusion survey that we talked about in the first segment, we added cultural expression and linguistic heritage.
Interesting. Okay, terrific. Shani, you mentioned something very interesting. Define what you mean by cultural humility.
Cultural humility is a relatively new term that emerged at the end of the 20th century. And it's really, again, an evolution from that 20th century notion of colorblindness, not seeing difference, which really isn't being affirming. Cultural humility says that we have to acknowledge the presence and importance of differences, which is very much a paradigm shift for many people. So by acknowledging the presence and importance of differences, we're thinking about how my differences and my perspectives, interactions, experiences may be different from yours. And so then with every interaction that we have with people, we're being cognizant of that and acknowledging that. And so then we can really realize the benefits of a really diverse population when we're doing that. But the key difference between cultural humility and cultural competence is that cultural competence denotes, while it's important, an awareness of cultural norms and practices from different cultures, but there's not a finite list, right?
Exactly.
Like you're never going to learn everything that one particular group does or doesn't do. So cultural competence, it's more about learning about the other. Cultural humility turns the mirror onto ourselves.
Okay.
And it's more about our own critical self-reflection and self-critique.
Very interesting. So expand upon that, because so many times you hear people say, and I think it's more being politically correct, I don't see color. I'm colorblind. What, from your experience, why do you think people tend to react like that?
I think it's because we just moved out of a time where, by acknowledging that I'm a Black woman, for example, you might, some of the biases and stereotypes that you may have heard or that you may have been socialized to have about either me being Black or African American or a woman may have some impact on how you interpret me.
Okay. Okay.
So I think now we're moving into a space where we're having more targeted conversations about diversity and difference. And we're saying, no, I want you to see me as a Black woman because the Black or African American and the woman part has a lot to do with my perceptions, experiences, and interactions.
Absolutely.
Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be the same as every other Black woman.
Right.
But by acknowledging those differences, then we can really realize the benefits of diversity, and we can really think about how do my perspectives different from yours.
Absolutely.
And then really you're building a more interdependent community when you do that. When you're embarking upon this lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, then you become more interdependent. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that South African proverb, Mbutu. It means I am because you are.
Yes.
So the more we learn about ourselves, the more we're able to learn about others,
Right.
and then we're able to really have a more cohesive community.
I love the term you talk about, critical evaluation, self-reflection, looking in the mirror yourself. Do you think that by people being vulnerable and being very raw about who they are as a person, that it connects people more, that they can both go through that process if they're both from different backgrounds or so forth?
I think that's really important that you mention that, because in some of the conversations and the trainings that we have, I don't like to call them trainings. I like to call them awareness opportunities.
Sure.
Because that's really what it is. It's facilitating that self-reflection. And you absolutely have to have some measure of vulnerability to be able to fall into that cognitive dissonance. We talk about leaning into discomfort because these conversations are usually not comfortable.
Absolutely.
Because we usually don't have them. So by providing those safe spaces for people to do that critical self-reflection with people who are like them and who are not like them, really it results in a lot of growth and development.
Absolutely. Would you be willing to share, could you give us some examples of some interaction, some of these trainings that you've done to where people really had an aha moment here about, they learned something about the interaction with somebody that was very different from them. Do you have any examples you could share?
There's one that happened just yesterday in a training I did yesterday, and we were talking about, again, exactly through this lens of cultural humility. An African American male asked, why do white people describe people of color by their race? He didn't understand because he kind of felt like, he said, when I hear other white people or Caucasians describe another Caucasian person, she's blonde or tall or has blue eyes, but when they're referring to a person of color, the first thing that comes to mind is their race.
Interesting.
And really it comes down to issues of privilege, that we are in a Caucasian-dominated society, and so race, being Caucasian, is normalized.
It's a differentiator in terms of from an Anglo person's perspective, Caucasian person's perspective. Very interesting.
Sure. So it's even those sorts of things. And he said, you know what? The African American male who said that, I never thought of it that way. And we really got into a wonderful conversation where people were speaking from the I perspective and being vulnerable about, well, here's why I do it. And then he was able to be vulnerable and go, I get it. But you have to be able to
Be in
have
somebody
those
else's shoes,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Tap into their lived experiences to be able to understand their different perspectives.
And I think really over the last few years, I think political correctness or whatever it be, particularly in the corporate world, where it was more just kind of a check the block thing. And I think the more diverse workforce now, they're demanding to be able to work in environments where people are accepted across the board and everybody has the same opportunities. So we have to have these conversations, but at a very deep level, not superficial, or you're just not getting anywhere.
Because then you can bring your full self to work or to school or to the organization because you know that all of your differences are going to be valued and affirmed.
Right. Another I want to talk to you about is the term equality versus equity. You have a very interesting slide that you presented some of these training sessions, and it really brings things into perspective. So talk about equality first and then how as it relates to equity.
Sure. Equality is really more of a 20th century term. 50 years ago, I might not be able to sit here talking to you. And so equality is about sameness, is about giving everybody the same thing, which in the 20th century, that's where we were trying to get to.
Yeah, and it was a big initiative, and it was important that we get,
Of course it was. But I think now in the 21st century, because we now have this notion of cultural humility and acknowledging differences, cultural humility is really the foundation for equity. Equity.
could you say that again?
Sure. Cultural humility, acknowledging the presence and importance of differences, is really the foundation for equity.
Wow.
Equity is giving people what they need, as opposed to giving everybody the same thing. And so sometimes equity, it's not sameness. Equity is fairness. And so that's a very big difference that people, even in the same training I was talking about yesterday, they were talking about equality. And I said, no. What you really want to do as someone who is a facilitator of student success is address your students with equity. Find out what their needs.
That's the ultimate goal, is
That
equity.
is the ultimate goal. But I think it really is a paradigm shift for many of us that are afraid to acknowledge that we're different. But you have to have that trust and vulnerability to be able to even move into that equity-mindedness where we're able to acknowledge that my differences may yield different needs.
Give me a concrete example then of a situation where you have two people from different circumstances. Why would the difference create, it's an equality, but to get it to an equitable level? Give us some examples, like somebody comes from more a poverty-stricken background or a woman vice a man, or...
I'll give you one perfect example. Think about people with disabilities.
Yes.
So we have on all of our campuses our coordinators or our offices of disability services, which provide accommodations for people with disabilities. So if I don't have a disability, why would I need an accommodation? So equality would be giving everybody the same accommodation, or assuming that an accommodation for something like ADHD would be the same as an accommodation for someone that maybe has a physical disability. They're different.
Right.
So you have to differentiate. It's really specialization. That's really what equity is specialization. Acknowledging that people's different needs require specialization, and then that way, whatever product or service or outcome, you're able to really specialize it based upon the needs of that person. You're being equitable.
Shani, before we close this segment, why don't you share with our audience another example of a very poignant exchange based on this whole concept of equity versus equality with maybe some of the students or even the faculty members here?
I can actually even speak, as I like to say in my sessions, from an I perspective.
Right.
And it's particularly related to cultural humility. I had a colleague of mine in my previous role and she was trying to build a relationship with me. We actually ended up being really great friends, who said when I first started working, she said, Shani, I don't see you as a Black woman. I see you as articulate and accomplished and very well spoken. And I said, well, but the reality, Lynn, is that me being a Black woman can operate in the same space as all of those positive things. And she said she walked away from that exchange going, but I thought I was giving her a compliment.
Yes.
But because...
That's her reality that you need to educate,
because she had these stereotypes in her mind about Black women, that in her mind, I was somehow different. I was breaking those stereotypes. So in order for her to really see me as all of those positive things, she had to separate being the Black woman from that. And I think that is something that we have to learn to do, is to integrate those differences, and those differences that maybe historically were looked at from a deficit-based perspective.
It's a teachable moment, so to speak, where initially it might be offensive, but thinking beyond that, how can I redirect the conversation and educate from my perspective? So that's where you really change the culture.
Exactly. And she thanked me. She said she walked away from that conversation initially being offended, going, but I was trying to give her a compliment. But then she said she really thought about it, and she thanked me for saying something. Because I think a lot of times these things happen and we don't correct it. So then the two people walk away from the exchange with a negative taste in their mouth, or maybe that they just promoted another stereotype. But again, I love what you said about vulnerability, that we have to be vulnerable enough to lean into the discomfort, to have these sorts of conversations that really end up being very, very productive when you have them.
And male or female with a diverse population, I know Tarrant County College has got an amazingly diverse student population. What's the one takeaway you've learned as a facilitator of this program, male or female, when you're talking to human beings like that? Is there a common thread at the end of the day that everybody is dealing with, a commonality across the board that you can never deny in terms of people's humanity?
It's interesting you would say that. I think there are a couple of things. One is getting people to realize that we all have biases, and those biases have a huge deal to do with how we see the world, how we move through the world and interact with each other. And that is one thing that's very difficult sometimes for people to swallow, but once they're able to swallow it and have an awareness of their biases and how it affects their interactions, it's really a gift.
Right.
And the other thing is that people, sometimes when we have these conversations and it's so heavy and it's, we're talking about bias and privilege and all of this heavy stuff, but then you realize you can be a change agent.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That you can take this awareness and share it with other people and apply it even into your personal life. And then again, that becomes a gift that we hope that we're giving to people as they go through this process of critical self-reflection.
Beautiful. Shani, fantastic. Again, another perfect segment. I appreciate it so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Siobhan Palmer with Plaid for Women Television with Shani Barrax Moore, the Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer at Tarrant County College. Appreciate your time, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching Plaid TV. See you next time.